The International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, is basically a list of all officially recognized diseases, medical conditions, disorders, and so on. If something is not on the ICD, it can't be diagnosed as a medical problem. In August 2018, a revised version of the ICD, the ICD-11, was published by WHO, and it contained a new extension code. That is, a code that doesn't identify a disease per se, but it allows to specify more details on a given disease. The code was XT9T, the aging-related code. Simply put, using this code in a diagnosis is equivalent to saying that a disease is caused by pathological processes which persistently lead to the loss of organisms' adaptation and progress in older ages. In plain English, it means that the disease is caused by harmful processes that go from bad to worse as you age. Some of the headlines and articles reporting this news were rather misleading because they openly said that aging itself had been classified as a disease, and this is not what happened. Aging is still very much not considered as a disease by WHO. However, the introduction of this code was the result of the lobbying of a group of longevity activists and aging researchers, and as a matter of fact, their initial proposal made the case that aging does meet the criteria to be classified as a disease and should be one. Obviously, WHO didn't quite agree with their proposal. There is still no disease code meant specifically for aging, but the lobbying group, as well as advocates of longevity all over the world, still considered this a success that took us closer to the day when aging will have a nice wanted mugshot in the ICD and finally be considered a disease. Which brings us to what I'd like to talk about with you today. Is aging a disease? Before I get to the point, I am sure you noticed that this is a somewhat different kind of episode by extant standards. It's a sort of semi-scripted type of video that is meant to give food for thought, hence the name, rather than be a full-blown science video about a paper or whatever scientific concept or a quiz or anything like that. Episodes like this are bound to have a lot of personal views and musings of the host or other people, so take everything with a grain of salt and draw your own conclusions, which we will be more than happy to read about in the comments below. So does aging, in a biological sense, qualify as a disease? Well, we can't really discuss the topic unless we first define both aging and disease. If you look for the definition of aging in the obvious places, that is, dictionaries, you get an obvious answer. Aging is the process of growing old. Didn't see that one coming. Scientific papers, however, give a bit of a more detailed, unforgiving picture. A time-dependent functional decline that affects most living organisms, characterized by a progressive loss of physiological integrity leading to impaired function and increased vulnerability to death. An age-dependent or age-progressive decline in intrinsic physiological function leading to an increase in age-specific mortality rate. The collection of changes that render human beings progressively more likely to die. A progressive deterioration of physiological function, an intrinsic age-related process of loss of viability and increase in vulnerability, and so on. There isn't much room for interpretation, and especially not positive ones. Now, instead, what is a disease? This is a lot trickier than you might think. Contrary to my expectations, WHO doesn't seem to formally define disease anywhere, though if I am mistaken and you know it, please do correct me in the comments. But anyway, that is odd, because its definition of health partly relies on the concept of disease, at least the way I've interpreted it. The WHO Constitution defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. If health isn't merely the absence of disease, then I take it to be at least the absence of disease plus other stuff. And that's problematic because it means that WHO's definition of health relies on an undefined term, or at the very least it relies on a common intuitive understanding of it that we all more or less have, and I feel that's really not specific enough. I say this because our intuitive understanding of disease is prone to subjective interpretations and is sensitive to the cultural context of the time. A great example of this is homosexuality, which went up and down the disease roller coaster for quite a while. It was categorized as an endocrine disturbance to be treated with hormones, then it was treated as a mental condition, but nothing that a good old electroshock couldn't fix anyway, and finally kicked out of the disease club for good in 1974. This is not the only example. Often disabled people don't think of their condition as a disability, but rather as a part of their identity. Certainly not all of them, but some do. Take deaf people, for example. I understand quite a few of them don't see themselves as disabled, but rather as a linguistic minority. Although deafness does have more than one code in the ICD. So yeah, the common understanding of disease varies too much to be of any use in a scientific context, and we need something better to work with. Now, I have looked up a few dictionary and medical dictionary definitions of disease, and they all say more or less the same thing. That is, that a disease is a definite pathological process that impairs normal functioning and has a characteristic set of signs and symptoms. It may affect the whole body or any of its parts, and its etiology, pathology, and prognosis may be known or unknown. Aging is definitely a process, actually a set of them, that affects the whole body. It may well be that your 80-year-old brain won't be in such a bad shape as, say, your joints, but to my knowledge, there have been no cases of people who age only here and there and not as a whole, so this checks out. The most visible signs and symptoms of aging may vary across individuals, but it doesn't mean that aging doesn't have a characteristic set of signs and symptoms. Not all symptoms of infectious or mental diseases appear in all cases either. They're not Pokemons, you don't gotta catch them all to have a specific disease. Less visible signs of aging seem to be more universal. I'm talking about the hallmarks of aging, described in the 2013 review on Cell, which you can watch an entire episode of ours about right here. The hallmarks of aging are 9 cellular and molecular processes observed rather systematically in aging mammals and humans, and a lot of scientists out there think that their sum total is what we call aging, which refers to the deterioration that eventually kills us all. Basically, grey hair, bad eyesight, high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, and all that you might see in a very old person at the macroscopic level is the result of the interaction of these devilish little f***ers at the microscopic level, and we seem to find them wherever we look, so this requirement checks out too. The etiology and pathology of aging, that is, its causes and the exact details about the cause-effect link, aren't entirely clear, though the prognosis is, and to a great degree of accuracy. Death in 100% of the cases. There is only one more requirement to fulfill before we could say that aging is a disease, and that's the impairment of normal functioning. Maybe you think this is the requirement that aging most obviously fits, and for the record, in my view, you'd be perfectly right. But there is a problematic word to deal with. Normal. Physicians go through a lot of pointless struggles to draw a line between pathological aging and normal aging, and frankly, I find that worth of all the eye-rolling in the world, and then some. And that's because A, when defining normal, your mileage may vary, and B, when you plug any scientific definition of aging into normal aging, you get things like normal progressive deterioration of physiological function, or normal process of loss of viability and increase in vulnerability to death. Yeah. Now, it's not like these things can't be normal. As a matter of fact, they're very much normal for elderly people in the sense that they're commonly observed. But the hidden implication of normal is everything is okay and you don't need to worry about it. When elderly patients are told that something is just a part of normal aging, they might think that that's perfectly alright, they don't need to worry about it. Although what it actually means is that they're falling apart just the way we expect them to do. Talk about a cold comfort. This was a point raised in one of the papers that I read while preparing this video. It makes zero sense to have different values for health indicators depending on your age. Higher blood pressure may be normal for the elderly, but that only means that we generally expect them to have higher blood pressure, not that healthy blood pressure is higher in the elderly. How common or uncommon higher pressure may be in the old means absolutely nothing in terms of how good or bad it is for them. This kind of reasoning is pretty much a case of appeal to normality, that is a logical fallacy that says basically that if something is common, then it's also alright, and it is brought up by some as a reason why aging couldn't be a disease. It happens to everyone. So? Everybody gets the flu. Should we throw it out of the ICD? Didn't think so. The paper I just mentioned further makes the case that there is no good reason why the normal values for functions in young adults are not applied in adults at all ages. In other words, the paper argues that normal values for health and function indicators, normal as in good for you, should be those observed in healthy young adults. Therefore, the values we commonly observe in the elderly should be considered abnormal, that is, unhealthy, as opposed to healthy for your age, which makes no sense at all. The paper also argues that there is no distinction whatsoever between normal aging and late life diseases, and it's not the only one. In the description below, you will find several of them, including a couple by gerontologist David Gems, who calls aging the greatest disease of them all. By the way, the supposed distinction between normal aging and late life pathologies isn't free from the same uncertainty of other cases. Osteoporosis, for example, was considered to be a part of normal aging until 1994, when it suddenly became a disease, and even senile Alzheimer's disease was considered to be normal up to 1977. Yep, losing your marbles is totally normal after a certain age. Nothing to worry about there. All fine. Personally, I'm not sure if aging is a disease, and the reason is purely technical. While I think it fits rather well the definitions of disease that I found, I am not sure if they are good enough, and so I can't be sure if aging really fits the bill or not. One option that I feel slightly more confident about is that aging might qualify as a syndrome, which is generally defined as a group of signs and symptoms that occur together but aren't necessarily correlated to one another. As I understand it, while in a disease you expect all the symptoms to stem from a single cause, in a syndrome symptoms can come from different causes that, for some reason, just happen to manifest together. Regardless, the reason why most rejuvenation advocates would like to see aging recognized as a disease seems to be that it would most likely speed up research on and production of drugs that attack the aging processes. As said, if it's not in the ICD, it's not a disease, and if it's not a disease, no one is gonna make a drug for it because it would never be approved, let alone sold. If aging were recognized as a legitimate medical target, pharma companies would have an incentive to work on drugs against it, and consequently, we might have drugs that affect age-related diseases sooner. For this reason alone, I am very much in favor of classifying aging as a disease regardless of the semantics. That's why the aging-related extension code introduced in 2018 is actually a very important first step. If you take a look at the ICD online, you'll see that this code is nested under two different subcategories, etiology and causality. It means that WHO does at least recognize the causal role of aging in late-life pathologies, even though it doesn't recognize aging itself as a disease. Better than nothing, I guess. I don't know why WHO didn't accept the idea of including aging in the ICD, despite the case made by the scientist who submitted the proposal, but I can imagine a couple of reasons why people in general may resist the idea. The first reason is that nobody wants to consider themselves sick. Being sick may mean suffering, limitations, and actions to be taken in order to recover, and in some cases taking action can be really hard and emotionally taxing and yield very little results, if any. If aging were recognized as a disease, everybody out there would have to live with the thought that they're eventually going to be sick, no matter what, simply as a consequence of being alive, and that's not a very nice thought. On the other hand, thinking that you wouldn't be sick but just old, and that less than ideal health is normal for old age, can be a very comforting thought, I guess, which changes pretty much nothing in terms of how healthy or alive you're going to be, but comforting nonetheless, I suppose. Secondly, some might be afraid that declaring aging a disease might cause the elderly to be discriminated against and marginalized even more than they already are. This concern is legitimate, and the reasons behind it are somewhat noble, but the conclusion drawn from it isn't very bright. AIDS patients were very much stigmatized in the early days, and probably still are in many places, yet we wouldn't have done them any kindness if we had decided that AIDS wasn't a syndrome to protect them from the risk of marginalization. Research might have been held back, and countless more people would have died. This type of thinking might well be the result of a pendulum swing. The sick and disabled used to be seriously discriminated against, and as a reaction to that extreme behavior, now we sometimes see the opposite. In the process of accepting sick and disabled people, we've also accepted the diseases and disabilities that are harming these people, treating these ailments as though they were nothing bad. But they are, though, as they can and do make the lives of millions miserable. I suspect this might be what has led to logical monstrosities like the concept of healthy aging. Remember how stupid normal aging sounds once we plugged in the definition of aging? Well, healthy deterioration of physiological function doesn't sound any less stupid. Granted, any term only means what it is defined to mean, and WHO defines healthy aging as the process of developing and maintaining the functional ability that enables well-being in older age. Still, WHO also defines aging as the result of an accumulation of a wide variety of cellular and molecular damage over time, which leads to a gradual decrease in physical and mental capacity, a growing risk of disease, and ultimately death. So I really don't think that healthy is quite the right word here. I get what WHO's intentions are, fighting ageism and helping out older people, but I think they're the kind of good intentions that the way to hell is paved with, and it becomes obvious when you look at this infographic of theirs. Every old person is different, alright, but that doesn't mean there is no typical older person, as they say on the healthy aging page of their website. There is. It's pretty typical for an 80-year-old not to see or hear very well, and not to have very many years ahead. There may well be outliers who fare much better than the rest of the people their age, but there also are clear trends showing how typical it is among older people to suffer from specific conditions. Besides, saying that some older people have the level of functioning of a 30-year-old is rather vague. How old is this older person? If the level of functioning is the same, why doesn't that person have the same remaining life expectancy? What kind of functioning are we talking about? The whole concept seems to focus more on helping older people through supportive infrastructure, social structures, etc., to keep them going despite the ill health of old age, rather than through the development of medical technologies that would eliminate ill health, making older people no more in need of external support than young people. That's like if you broke a leg and instead of having it fixed, you were given a crutch to help you walk with a broken leg for the rest of your days. Also, there is a fair amount of self-contradiction on WHO's part. Their definition of aging makes it clear that it is bad for you, and yet they say we should change the way we think about it, presumably putting a positive spin on it, but it's hard to frame damage that leads to a decrease in function and eventually death that way. The WHO page on healthy aging also says that the assumption that elderly people are often frail and dependent is an outdated and ageist stereotype, while saying a few paragraphs above that as we age, we are more and more likely to suffer from multiple chronic conditions and health problems, including the same frailty that a moment ago was just a stereotype. My personal opinion, and I may well be wrong about it, is that advertising things like healthy aging may only obfuscate the truth that aging is anything but healthy, no matter how you frame it, and it might hinder the development of therapies against it. It doesn't really matter if aging qualifies as a disease or not, it's still bad for you. A kick in the teeth is not a disease, and yet there is plenty of reasons not to want one, isn't there? Aging is bad for you. Does it qualify as a disease? Maybe. I tend to think it's more of a syndrome, but that's just my uneducated opinion. What do you think? Do you agree? Did I get it entirely wrong? Did I leave something out that you feel should have been mentioned? Let us know in the comments below. Alright, thank you very much if you actually made it through the end of this huge rant, and if you like rants, but also educational videos on the topic of aging and games and quizzes and talks and a lot more, please subscribe to our channel, and if you liked this particular video, the whole X10 team would appreciate it if you gave it a like or shared it with your friends. I would also like to thank the Lifespan Heroes, who are the patrons who financially support us through their donations. They make X10 possible, they make our crowdfunding campaigns possible, they make our blog possible, and so on. So if you like what we do as much as they do, maybe consider joining them on lifespan.io/hero. So that's about all for this video. Thank you very much again for watching it, and I will see you next time. Take care.